Thanks everyone for joining. And before starting, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on a variety of lands today. I'm located in Bayside, so I'd like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Danielle King, CitySwitch Program Manager for the Greater Metro Regions, and I'll be presenting this webinar for you today. The session's being recorded so it can be made available online at our CitySwitch YouTube channel for anyone who's missed it or would like to watch it again later. I'll send the link to the recording and some of the other resources we'll talk about during the presentation after the session. We've got quite a bit to go through today, so if possible, can we keep questions to the end or put them into the chat box and we'll work through them when we're finished. Also, I'll try to keep everybody on mute as we go through the meeting just to stop any disturbing noises. Right, let's get on with it. So here's what we'll be covering. First, we'll have a quick reminder of why it matters to you and your business to look at going carbon neutral. Then I'll talk about what carbon neutral means, the different ways you can achieve it, and I'll touch on preparation, the process, and what's involved. I'll also show you some different case studies of time and costs for various sized organisations, and then we'll finish by taking a quick look at the benefits of why it matters. So why does it matter? Let's have a quick recap on the big issue. So as you all know, climate change is one of the biggest threats we're currently facing. Now it's further complicated by COVID. There have been many frameworks to assist countries, businesses and people in moving towards a more sustainable lifestyle, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you have probably seen and may be working towards implementing in your own businesses. This is all underpinned by the United Nations Paris Agreement of 2015, which has been adopted by over 195 countries, including Australia. The aim of that is to keep global temperature rise this century to below 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, with efforts to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees C. Now, to achieve that, countries have pledged to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, and Australia has signed up to that pledge, but sadly on current trajectories, we're unlikely to meet that goal. And of course, temperatures are continuing to rise. So this graph's an update issued by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology last month, and it shows that here in Australia, we're already over 1 degree C above the average compared to 1961-1990 averages. So we all need to take action to reduce emissions and adjust to our new norm of extremes. And here are some of our new norms and how it's affecting us. We're experiencing more intense and devastating cyclones along the coast, more floods, more droughts, more fires, and more health problems. You'll probably recall that smoke from those bushfires in New South Wales blanketed Sydney in December 2019 right through to February 2020 for many weeks. The air quality index measured Sydney's air quality at 12 times above hazardous levels, making it the worst air quality in the world for that time, and increasing hospitalisations due to respiratory issues by over 10% across the state. And on top of that, between 2015 and 2019, just Australia, experienced about $5 billion worth of economic loss and over 300 deaths due to extreme events, and that doesn't include these recent bushfires that we had. So it's pretty serious. And of course, there's other impacts as well that we're now experiencing, things like heat stress that result in increased hospital admissions across the country on extreme heat days. We've got some of those slower events that aren't so obvious so quickly, such as sea level rise, which is now starting to cause issues. You might remember last year, there were about 40 homes in Wembarrel Beach in New South Wales, north of Sydney, saw their backyards disappear into the water and structures collapsed due to a combination of storms and erosion. Some of these events also resulted in food shortages in our supermarkets. Don't know if you've noticed, but the last few years on and off, there's been signs up in some of the main supermarkets stating that certain products are unavailable due to climate events impacting the food chain. I'm sure it won't be the last time we see that. In terms of businesses, there's also increased business risk due to climate events and business risk registers, which are particularly impacting things like superannuation funds, financial institutions and insurance companies. It's also impacting us being able to build in certain areas through bushfire regulation changes and costs, and even the option of purchasing insurance in certain areas is now cost prohibitive or simply not available in those high risk areas. So climate and the impacts are now affecting most of us and our organisations at some level, and it's up to all of us to take action. So being part of the solution includes what you do personally, how you run your organisation, and how you do your work. With businesses, there are many things that can contribute, from being mindful of what you purchase, how much energy you use, and where it comes from, through to how you do your business. And demonstrating action can be achieved in a variety of ways, including going carbon neutral. So as a business, differentiating your services by doing things better often not only saves emissions, it can also save money. And while actions like achieving carbon neutrality is not an easy task, the benefits are definitely worth it. So let's take a look about how you do that. The first thing you'll notice is the language. There's a whole range of terms that you'll hear when discussing going carbon neutral. There will be a glossary with the resource that we'll send out after this session, but these are the main terms you'll come across. So carbon neutral, net zero emissions, net zero, it's all pretty much the same thing. It's about achieving a balance between what carbon you emit as a result of doing your business and what you absorb from the atmosphere. There's also a term called climate neutral, which is a UN initiative encouraging everyone to take action. You'll hear a carbon account, carbon footprint, carbon inventory being bounced around. It's basically the same thing. It's an inventory of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted as a result of your business doing whatever it is that it does. Emissions are the greenhouse gases that are discharged into the atmosphere, which leads to climate change. The main five are water vapour, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone and nitrous oxide, and the chlorofluorocarbons. They're usually expressed as a CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon is now a financial instrument as well, and its traded unit is an offset. The emissions boundary is what is included and excluded from your carbon inventory. Scope 1, 2 and 3 are also emission categories, but they are to ensure that double accounting is avoided when you're doing your inventory. There's also a carbon credit or an offset, which is basically a permit which is generated by an organisation or a country for storing or avoiding emissions. One carbon credit is basically the same as 1 tonne of CO2e. And as I mentioned, they are financial instruments and can be traded with organisations or countries that generate emissions to offset them. And finally, we have carbon positive, which basically means that you're offsetting more emissions than you emit. This provides additional benefits by removing more than your fair share or additional greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. Now, there's currently no standards on how much extra or more you need to generate or offset to say that you're carbon positive, but there's likely to be a standard coming out soon. So basically, being carbon neutral is about having a balance between what you emit and what you absorb, so neutralising your impact on the environment. But how do you know what emissions you're emitting? You measure it, and that's your carbon inventory or footprint. So you measure your organisation's emissions, you reduce what you can, and you offset what's left. Sounds pretty simple, but it can get quite complex. Now, most companies will measure their first year and offset that, and then implement carbon reduction strategies for the following years. And when you do that, ensure you do it in line with a recognised and credible standard. The standards that all carbon neutral calculations and claims should be made against here in Australia are these. The Australian Government's Climate Active Carbon Neutral Standard, previously known as NCOS, or the National Carbon Offset Standard. This standard is in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO standards, but also has a few differences which are mainly in relation to the emission factors. This standard is the most commonly used in Australia and can be downloaded freely from the Climate Active website. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard and provides a framework to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions. It contains several standards that work together to form an overall protocol, and the protocol can also be freely downloaded from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. There's also the Carbon Trust Standard, which is a recognised international carbon accounting standard, which is mostly used in Europe. You don't see it very much here in Australia, but it is available. There's also ISO 14040 and ISO 14064 standards, which will need to be purchased if you want to read them. But the key items from those in relation to greenhouse gas emissions are embedded in these other standards, so you shouldn't need to purchase them. Now, there's a few pathways to achieving carbon neutral. In Australia, they primarily include Climate Active certification, which is the most highly regarded and trusted, but it does take time and financial investment. There are independent third-party carbon neutral certification organisations around, which are generally a bit cheaper. They still take time and financial investment. And then there's the self-certification against a chosen standard. So you can certify against Climate Active, or you can certify against one of the protocols. It's very much more a claim rather than a certification. It is the cheapest, it still takes time, and it can be complex if you do it yourself. If you've done yourself, you can avoid the external costs of other offsets, but you'll still need to work out your emissions and the emissions factors. But at the end of the day, it's about what you want to claim and if your claim holds credibility. So, for example, the government's Climate Active certification meets quite strict standards. They are independently validated and transparent, so anyone looking can be sure that the claim is real, accurate, and true. Other bodies that provide certification that follow a similar robust process are generally well regarded. Certification through organisations that do not independently validate or are not transparent don't have that additional layer of validation and transparency, so it's up to the individual to determine its value. And self-certification isn't really certification, it's really a claim. You basically would be claiming that your business is carbon neutral yourself. You can add credibility to this by claiming against one of the standards, getting independent data validation, and being transparent with how you've done it. Any self-certification should be transparent about the emissions, the offsets, and which standard you've used to comply with. So ultimately, it's going to come down to what you want to claim and if you want a credible logo. So here are a couple of examples. The Australian Government's Climate Active certification, as I said, is the most reputable in Australia. Carbon accounts are independently validated and assessed. Carbon emissions must be publicly stated in a public disclosure statement. And if you want to see some samples, get onto the Climate Active website because they can be readily downloaded from there. Other private organisations can also provide certification. In Australia, there's only one other company, and there's also a New Zealand company that can certify companies in Australia. These private organisations don't tend to have the same requirements in terms of disclosure and validations that Climate Active has, but you can also use international certifications like the Carbon Trust if they're relevant to your organisation, like if it's a global company that you're working with. The third example here was made up by a company who's self-certified. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but the company using this should also publicly state what standard it was certified against, and ideally the data should have been independently validated. So the bottom line is it comes down to credibility of what you want to claim and what you want to market. And just something worth noting is that the ACCC has quite significant rules now on greenwashing, and they've been coming down pretty hard on some companies lately if anyone makes a false claim. So just make sure that you're aware of the ACCC rules. You can download that from their website, so you don't want to get caught up with that. So this is a bit of a messy slide. I apologise for that, but you'll get a copy of this later. But in an attempt to clarify this, I've created a summary table of the pathways to help work through the differences in the methods that are available. So don't try and read it. The key differences here really are independent validations required, the standards that are applied, the costs that are involved, public disclosure, whether it's required or not, the use of logos, and the emission factors that are used. Climate Active will provide the carbon inventory and emission factors as part of the fees that they charge. If you self-certify, you'll need to identify your own emission factors from credible sources and be prepared to justify why you chose those. Once you've decided what you want to claim, then the next thing is to decide what sort of certification you're looking for. Because Climate Active is the most reputable certification, this is the certification process that we'll follow on and we'll focus on for the rest of this session. Now, as with anything, you need to be aware of the time and cost commitment. So here's some things to set your expectations. Certification through Climate Active or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Standard is done either financial or calendar years. It'll usually take around 6 months. It's a bit of a process and requires time and financial investment. Certification through any type of body is annual and is valid for the year certified only. The process is designed for annual recertification, and companies should budget to include this in their annual budget cycles going forward. Self-certifying should also be done using the financial year or the calendar year and in line with either the Climate Active or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. So if you choose to get certification later, it's a very easy transition to go from self-certifying to a more formal certification. So gather all the information you can and decide which pathway you want to do, which standard to align to, and what timeframe works best for your organisation, whether it's a financial or a calendar year. Now, regardless of which method you choose, the process is generally the same. Carbon neutral claims are done on an annual cycle of measure, reduce, offset, validate, report, repeat. The first year usually requires the most effort and cost in terms of data validation. Future years are usually a little bit less. Now, with climate active certification, there are several types that you can choose. The organisation category covers from a small organisation through to a large organisation, and the fees will differ and they do increase depending on the size of the business and the emissions profile that your company has. Products and services can be certified as well, but generally require a life cycle assessment to be completed and all emissions offset to claim a carbon neutral product. To certify a product or service, the organisation must first be certified and the product or service then added. It's a separate certification. Events and precincts can also be separately certified. And then there's the buildings. There are only two current pathways for buildings to be certified carbon neutral by Climate Active, and that's through using the NABERS whole or base building ratings, or as an extension to Green Star performance rating. It's applicable only to commercial and apartment buildings at this time. A path for buildings that do not wish to obtain NABERS energy or Green Star performance rating is likely to be developed in the future, but it's not currently available. Saying that, you could still claim a building as net zero emissions by doing a carbon inventory of the energy use and offsetting it annually. Remember, for it to have any credibility, you need to be very transparent, use a recognised standard, and have it ideally independently validated. But for our purposes, the most common certification type is organisational, so this is what we'll be working through now. So once you've chosen the type of certification you're after, the emission boundary is the next thing that needs to be defined. The boundary is important because this is where you choose what emissions are included and what's excluded from your inventory. Climate Active has three different types of approach. There's operational, financial, and equity share approaches. The operational control is the most common approach used, and this limits the emission sources to those items that your organisation has control over in terms of being able to enforce process changes or similar. Now, your carbon accountant or advisor should be able to guide you on what the most appropriate control approach would be for your organisation, but generally the operation approach is the one that's used. There are also certain mandatory emission sources that must be included in an organisational boundary. They are all stationary energy and fuels that are used in the buildings, machinery or vehicles that are within the entity's control, all electricity consumed by the building, machinery or vehicles that are within your control, and all other emissions which are within the approach or able to be influenced by the entity seeking certification also need to be assessed for relevance through a relevant test. This could include some emissions that are outside the approach of your organisation. So what do they measure? The standards provide the framework for calculating the emissions and breaks them down into what's termed scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Now, scope 1 is direct emissions from your activity, for example, fuel combustion and company vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from things that you directly use but don't create, and that includes purchased electricity and gas. Scope 3 has upstream and downstream emissions, which includes purchased goods and services, transport for employees, freight and postage, waste, business travel, accommodation, IT costs, and so on. Each of these items has an associated greenhouse gas emission factor, which together makes up your business's carbon footprint. So this is an example of what's included in a Climate Active small organisation fixed emissions boundary. And this provides a good indication of the minimum information that you'll need to source for your own organisation carbon footprint. For medium and large organisations, the boundary will be larger and include more items from your profit and loss statement. But in this example, and for most of them, you'll always need to include things like accommodation and facilities, air transport, chemicals, cleaning, electricity, food and catering, ICT services, and so on. These are standard things that you'll need to be able to get data for. So what sort of data do you need to collect for all of these? Well, some of the data required is taken from the profit and loss statement, and other data like energy use, fuel and accommodation needs to be provided in specific units, such as kilowatt hours, litres of fuel, kilometres travelled, and so on. So this slide here shows a summary of the primary information that you'll need to get access to. It's worth keeping in mind that things like business travel, for example, you'll need to track the kilometres travelled and how. So if it's by air, you need to know the class of travel as well. And when you're staying at hotels, the accommodation type, the star rating, and the number of nights is also needed, because emission factors differ between a 4-star hotel and a 2-star hotel, just as they do if you were flying business class versus economy. Now, a lot of that data is accessible through doing things like, if you know you did 2 trips to Sydney, you could look on Google Maps and get the flight miles from there, and then you know what class you travelled and so on. But it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes getting that information. So it's worth keeping the information requirements in mind and ensuring that you're capturing, or that you can get the relevant data before looking at doing a carbon inventory. So if you're working with a carbon consultant, they're likely to have a data collection template or a checklist that they can provide as part of their services. We've also created a checklist of data for signatories, which I'll email with the links later. But do bear in mind that the emission sources are likely to be slightly different between organisations. So this list here doesn't cover everything that you'll be asked for during carbon inventory, but it does cover the key things. So if you're using the small organisation boundary, the emission sources are fixed. So I'll just quickly talk you through the process. This is a climate active certification process. So it will help and save you a lot of time if you have someone who understands it to assist with getting all the relevant documentation together, doing the carbon inventory, getting the validations and sorting the relevant paperwork, and helping with public disclosure statements. So most businesses hire a carbon accountant or a registered consultant to prepare the account, to work through the process and submit the claim. The tasks in orange here could be done by your carbon accountant, or they could be done in-house, depending on what skills you have and what you choose to do. So first you'll need to register with Climate Active and obtain a license agreement. This covers the use of the Climate Active certification logo, and it also provides you and your consultant with the carbon inventory spreadsheets for the carbon account. The inventory contains all the required emission factors that need to be used and the emission sources that need to be accounted for. The next step is to set the approach, the timeline, and define the organisation boundary. Now, organisations are identified by their ABN number. You can select operational, financial, or equity share approach, control approaches. As I said earlier, most go through the operational control approach. Once you've defined that, you'll then need to collect and collate the required data and calculate your emissions. Now, that's very short sentence, but it's actually quite a lot of work. To do that, you'll need to complete the carbon inventory spreadsheet sent by Climate Active and use their calculators for electricity and waste at a minimum. Once the footprint's completed and you know what the total emissions are, you'll need to develop an emissions reduction strategy and plan to start implementing it to reduce emissions for the next inventory. If you have a carbon consultant, they'll be able to work with you to define the emission reduction strategy that works best for you and your organisation. Now, while that's happening, you'll need to organise independent validation of the source data in the inventory. Depending on the size of the organisation and what category your business falls into, a certified practicing accountant may be able to do it, or you may also need a registered consultant. These are usually external costs and are highly variable depending on who you go to. The data validation needs to be done on the first carbon account and does not need to be done again unless there is a material change to the organisation, for example, if you merge with another business. And the purpose is to ensure that the carbon source data is correct at the start and therefore should be correct going forward. If your business is a medium or a large organisation, you'll also need a technical assessment which validates that the carbon inventory is correct. A registered consultant is needed to do this, and costs again will vary widely. This is required on the first year of the carbon inventory and again every 3 years thereafter. Once the carbon inventory and emissions figures are confirmed, you can then purchase offsets. Offsets will need to meet specific criteria identified in the Climate Active Offset Guidance Note, and offset pricing can vary very much. You can get them from $2 to $45 a tonne. And buying offsets is a bit like investing in a company. You want to be sure that the project you invest in supports and aligns with your organisation values, so allow time to review the offset options because there are quite a few out there. Once that's done and you've got your offsets, you'll need to create a public disclosure statement, and Climate Active will send you the template for that. And if you've used a consultant, they should also provide you with a carbon report. Then the documentation, including the inventory, the data validation, the assessment reports, the proof of offsets, and the public disclosure statement, is basically packaged up together and then submitted to Climate Active, who will review it. They'll come back to you if they've got any questions, but once it's approved, they'll then send you an invoice for their fees. Once that's paid, you'll get the certification certificate, receive the logos, and you can start marketing your carbon neutral status publicly. Now, just be aware that the validation itself, from when you submit all your documents to getting the final invoice and all the relevant logos, could take up to 6 weeks to come through. So if you're planning marketing and announcements and things, make sure that you allow plenty of time for that. And the whole process overall can take at least 6 months for this to happen. So as you can see, it is a process. It does take time. It does take effort and patience to complete. Now let's take a look at some of the fees, which I think is probably what you're all going to be interested in. Now, the Climate Active fees vary depending on the size of the organisation and the annual emissions. So this is an extract here from their 2019-2020 fee schedule. We don't have the 2021 schedule yet. This can be downloaded from their website at any time. For organisations, you'll see there are 3 categories: small, medium and large. The Climate Active fees are based on the size, its carbon emissions and the criteria that it needs to meet, which is listed on the right. So as an example, a small organisation is an organisation that has a small carbon footprint, which is defined as being less than 1,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions a year, and meets the other criteria. So it also needs to have less than $10 billion annual turnover, less than 30 full-time employees, consolidated gross assets of less than $30 million, but also 80% of the emissions boundary from the fixed small organisation boundary. So if your organisation meets that criteria, the Climate Active fee for you to certify each year will be $820, which is much more reasonable than what it used to be. Anything that doesn't fit into that category is considered a medium or a large organisation. So medium organisations are those that have a larger carbon footprint, so over 1,000 tonnes of emissions, or if it's less than 1,000 tonnes, they also have more than $10 million turnover, more employees, etc. As an example, if your organisation was at the lower end of the emission scale for this, your annual certification fees would be around $2,627 a year. But if you've got a lot of emissions, if your emissions are high, it could be up to $13,238 to certify per year. Large organisations are any organisation with a carbon footprint of over 25,000 tonnes of emissions, or if they fall outside of the medium organisation criteria. Now, there are other associated costs, which include the carbon accountant and in-kind time from staff, data validation and technical assessment, which needs to be done by consultants. So additional to the certification fees, these are the other costs that you need to allow for. There's a carbon accountant fees, and these again are highly variable and dependent on the size of the carbon account needing to be compiled. A small organisation could be anything from $2,000 upwards, and a large organisation could pay up to $25,000 for a carbon inventory. You'll need time from in-house staff to get the raw data to the carbon accountant. Again, the larger the organisation, the more time it tends to need. I'd recommend putting in place some processes to make data collection simpler for yourselves as you go through it and into the future. Data validation is conducted by an external accountant or similar and can cost anything from $600 to $18,000, depending on the size of what they need to do. It's usually a once-off fee to ensure that the data is correct at the start, and it will only need to be redone if there's a significant change to the business. The technical assessment is required for the first year and every 3 years afterwards for Climate Active submissions that are in the medium organisation category upwards. And it must be done by a registered consultant, and there is a list of those on the Climate Active website. Costs again will vary, anywhere from $1,800 for a small organisation up to around $20,000 for a large organisation. Offset costs again will vary widely depending on how much you need to offset and which offsets you choose. As mentioned earlier, they'll range in price from $2 a tonne to $45 a tonne, so could make a significant impact depending on what you choose. And finally, if you have a large organisation or want someone else to collect, measure and manage your utility data for carbon accounting and reporting, and probably for other reasons, you may have data management costs. These again can be highly variable and could cost anything from a few $1,000s to $60,000 or $70,000 a year, depending on your company and what you need it to do and how many sites it's tracking. So let's have a look at some real examples to give you an idea of the total costs. So let's start with a small organisation. In the past, small organisations have been reluctant to obtain carbon neutral certification due to the costs involved. We've known small organisations who've paid around $10,000 for a carbon account, offsets and fees, when their actual carbon footprint and offsets required to get them carbon neutral has been less than about $1,000. So for a small organisation, that's a big hit, and it's not really been much in terms of value for money. So with that in mind, and to assist the uptake of Climate Active certifications, last year Climate Active created a new small organisations category. It provides much the same rigour as the standard certification, but at a more cost-effective price. So to be considered a small organisation, your company needs to have the lower carbon footprint, less than 1,000 tonnes per year, less than a $10 million turnover, less than 30 full-time employees, etc. Now note that from the small organisation boundary has been defined with a small office-based business in mind, so such as architects, designers, accountants, etc. If you're a small organisation that has products, you'll need to look at it very carefully to make sure that you meet the criteria before you apply. In this example, the small organisation had 5 employees in one small office. It took about 7 months to do from start to finish, and that was because there were a few changes happening at Climate Active, so things had to be redone at times. They paid $3,200 for their carbon inventory from a carbon accountant. The data validation was $600, and they paid $820 in certification fees. The offsets that they chose were around $21 a tonne, so their offsets came in at $2,000 roughly for the 99 tonnes that they needed to offset. Now, for a small organisation, they only needed to have this independent validation for the first year, and they don't need a technical assessment. So the key takeout from this one was that they found that they needed to make some minor changes to their P&L and expenses to better track their ICT expenses, but the rest of the data was readily available through fuel receipts and the like. So this one, their total expenditure was around $6,700. Now, if your company doesn't meet the small organisation category, you'll probably fit into the medium organisation category. So here's an example of one of those. This particular company spent quite a bit of time collecting and collating data because they had 3 different sites, 3 different offices. Its first year costs included $8,500 roughly in carbon inventory costs from the carbon accountant. The data validation was around $1,500, and the technical assessment was $2,300. And the Climate Active fees came in at $7,985. And that was, we'll talk about that in a second. The Climate Active fees are stepped depending on the size of the company, type of certification, and the amount of the emissions. And unfortunately, once this particular organisation included the base building energy, which does need to be included, it put them into the higher overall emissions category, which increased their certification fees from $2,627 to $7,900. So in this example, the first year cost was around $35,671. All else being the same, next year would be less, the cost of the data validation and the technical assessment. So they'd probably save $3,800 on next year's. But if this company was able to reduce their emissions by just 256 tonnes, which wouldn't be that difficult to do, they would drop into the lower emissions bracket and save themselves over $5,000 on the next Climate Active certification fee. So that's a really good incentive to reduce emissions. Now let's have a look at a large organisation. Large organisations are likely to need data collection systems, an external company or internal FTEs to collect and collate some of the information required for the carbon account, such as energy, water and waste data. This organisation completed the carbon accounting concurrently with their NGERS reporting. They use a utility management system to capture electricity, water and gas, and licence fees for that were around $60,000 a year. So there was a significant data collection exercise, especially to request and obtain data from contractors so that emissions could be accurately calculated. This particular organisation has well over 2,000 employees, has a power purchase agreement in place, which also significantly reduces their emissions. It was estimated that if the PPA wasn't in place, the emissions for this organisation would be around 30,000 tonnes instead of the 12,000, which would also push the offsets to over $100,000 in terms of cost, and the total cost to over $200,000 for the year to certify. Now, it's worth, as I mentioned, the data monitoring system licenses could cost quite a bit of money, up to $60,000, depending on the organisation, number of sites being monitored and other things. If you choose an off-site company, data management costs will again depend on the amount of data being collected and the deal that you can get with a suitable provider. But the data management costs have been excluded from the summary above, but do be aware that it would be a significant cost. So for this particular organisation, it took 4 to 6 months. They were doing it concurrently with some other work. Footprint was around 12,000 tonnes, but without the power purchase would have been around 30,000 tonnes. The costs were basically 0.3 of a person internal. The carbon inventory was $20,000 a year. The initial independent data validation was $15,000, and that was the once-off fee. The technical assessments around $20,000 every 3 years. The climate active fees were $13,238. The offsets that they chose here, they chose a variety of offsets, and that's something worth knowing. You don't have to choose all your offsets from one provider. You can get some from one and half from another if you want. But the total cost for this one was about $132,000. But without that PPA, it would have been well over $200,000. So that covers off an example of costs for 3 different types and sizes of organisation for climate active certification for carbon neutrality. So one of the other things that we get asked a bit about is the emissions reduction side of things. So here's some of the common strategies that get applied. So as you've seen, going carbon neutral definitely requires budgeting for it, but it can also be an excellent driver to reduce emissions, demonstrate action on climate change, and help you meet organisation targets. Some of the most popular emission reduction strategies you'll come across are these. So purchasing green power, upgrading equipment and processes to improve efficiency, fuel reduction strategies such as route planning and transitioning to lower carbon transport options. You could also look for carbon neutral products to transition to, for example, carbon neutral energy or internet. But to do that, you must be sure that there are actually climate active carbon neutral certified products or services, because otherwise you'll have to admit those from your carbon account. And reducing emissions generally also saves the organisation money. So one of the final things I wanted to note here is that all climate active certified organisations must make a public disclosure statement, which is put online on the Climate Active website. You'll get your own page on the Climate Active site, but you must be prepared to disclose your emissions. Now, the disclosure statement details the reporting period, the description of your organisation and the certification type, what your emissions boundary is and how it was defined, a summary of your organisation's carbon emissions, information on your carbon reduction strategies, and details of the offsets that you purchased. If you want to see some of these, you can just go to the Climate Active website and download any of the certified organisations' public disclosure statements and see what their offsets are and what their details are in relation to being carbon neutral, because that's exactly what you'll need to disclose. So finally, I think becoming carbon neutral is quite important because it does put a completely different lens on your operations and the impact of your organisation. It makes you part of the solution, of the climate solution. It differentiates you from your competitors and provides marketing advantages through improved reputation. It can also contribute to winning business where sustainability credentials are requested, and that's becoming more common these days. It provides leadership in your sector and puts peer pressure on others to keep up. Reduces costs by driving reductions in emissions, which can also reduce costs. It engages stakeholders, including attracting and retaining staff, brings in more customer loyalty and can create goodwill. It also mitigates the risk of possible future regulation and carbon taxes and demonstrates action on climate. And more councils, businesses and consumers are preferencing companies that are part of the climate solution. So achieving carbon neutral certification shows your business is taking it seriously and is taking action. So to finish, I'd just like to say that this is our decade. And to quote from William James, we should all act as if everything we do makes a difference, because it does. And now it's time to measure your emissions, take action to reduce them, offset what you can't, certify carbon neutral, and be part of the solution. And if we all pledge to do that and be carbon neutral by 2030, we'll be making a significant difference. So I hope that's given you all a reasonable overview of what to expect and what's involved in going carbon neutral. I'll send out the cheat sheets I've created for everybody that's registered, and that includes the pathway summary, the common emission sources you'll find, a summary of their various levels of certification fees. And a recording of this webinar will also be made available on our CitySwitch YouTube channel by the end of the week. So thanks for coming, and I'll now open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute your mic, or I will go into the chat box as well and see if there's any.
I have one. It's Alana from Turner and Townsend.
Hello, how are you?
Good, Buzz, and yourself?
Good, thank you.
That's good. I just wanted to see off the back of when companies do commit to that highest level of certification, is there ever any studies that look at return on investment in terms of, obviously the outlay is, like you were saying, for some companies $130,000. Is there any tangible research off the back of that that shows that there's something comparable in the way that the company saves money in that space, or?
I haven't seen anything. I don't know if anybody else has, but I haven't seen anything out there. I think the benefits are more in lines of meeting organisational goals, and if they pledge to be carbon neutral, or if they want to do the right thing by the environment or demonstrate they're taking action, that's how they can do it. But in terms of return on investment, I don't know of any studies actually that.
Danny, Zoe from CitySwitch Sydney here. Alana, that's such an interesting question. My feeling is that at the moment there probably hasn't been studies, and my sense would be that at the moment organisations are paying more than they save or make, but there's a real opportunity in that if you're setting a carbon neutral goal, part of the kind of getting there would be switching to renewable energy. We know that that cost parity has come down, and if black energy prices continue to rise, you're going to see some savings there. Ideally, you're going to start to see, the return on investment in terms of customers coming to you as a preference over companies that don't have that carbon neutral. But the broad strokes answer, I think, at the moment is people are doing it because they want to have achieved that, rather than there's a financial return on investment, if that makes sense. So maybe some of the signatories who are already certified carbon neutral can let us know if that's the case, and whether that was a question from their board or senior management on whether they would make money.
I certainly know there's been tenders out, and a lot of council tenders these days include requirements to be taking action, environmental action of some sort, whether it's through having policies or being carbon neutral or something like that. So I know that there's definitely been benefits in terms of winning business through having good environmental credentials, and being carbon neutral is one of those good environmental credentials that you could do.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's more non-linear at this stage in terms of the benefits for companies. I just know that from us, if we were to put this to our board, there would definitely be a focus on the financial aspect of it, but preempting those sorts of questions, like you said, the things that you've explained about attracting customers, it may not be linear in terms of tangible physical money that we can see, but if we look at it from a winning work perspective, then yes, there is something there.
It would be interesting to see actually, because it's a funny beast to. Most sort of environmental things, you can find some way to cost justify it over a period of time. But with this one, it's there's so many intangible benefits to it. Tricky one. Good question. If I ever find out, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Hi, Danielle. I was just going to ask, if you're going carbon neutral and you're working with a consultancy or an external business to go carbon neutral rather than doing it yourself, are they going to help you with policy development in, say, different environmental areas, waste reduction, things like that? Or is it you have to develop the policy, they just help you with the carbon accounting?
It depends on the carbon accountant and what you specify in the work package to get them to do. I would certainly expect them to be they should be more than capable of coming up with carbon reduction strategies for any of the emission sources that you would have. So whether it's waste, energy, ICT, whatever it might be, any decent carbon accountant should be able to give you some indication or some ideas on how you can, some strategies to reduce those emissions. Part of doing the job, I think, in my view, you should be able to. So if you're working with a consultant or a carbon accountant, they should be able to give you actions and ideas on how you can reduce your emissions in each area.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Was there any in the chat?
Danny, there's a question from Nick from IAG around internal carbon price that I don't have an answer to, but you might.
Internal carbon price.
The question is, for large organisations, have you come across any companies that have used an internal carbon price to further drive down emissions?
No, I haven't actually. Good idea though. But no, I don't know of any that are doing that.
I was going to read your question out, Chris, but I'll let you do that.
Sure, no, the question is about embodied energy, or embodied carbon, and when that's likely to be considered by Climate Active.
That's only really considered when you look at it, from my understanding, and I'm not a Climate Active specialist or anything. I think some of that's picked up in terms of like the life cycle of the products, for example, if it was a product or a service certification. But generally speaking, I'm not real sure on that one.
Right, yeah, I see your comment, James. Yeah, it has to some extent, although I don't think it has for the building, the Climate Active ratings for buildings, to the extent that it probably needs to. So I understand that.
No, for buildings, it only really picks up the energy use and the water use, etc. It won't pick up the embodied emissions in the actual building fabric itself, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Guys, there's another question here from SK Hill. Sorry, I don't know who you are. Do we have a list of recommended carbon auditors? Zoe from CitySwitch just answering that. We are a government body, so we can't recommend commercial goods or services, but we do have a number of carbon consultants and accredited auditors who are members of CitySwitch. So you can check out our signatory directory, or have a chat to fellow signatories, or put a question in the CitySwitch LinkedIn group just to say, has someone worked with a consultant that that they were really happy with, and get a recommendation for fellow CitySwitch members is a good way to find someone good.
There's also the Climate Active list of registered consultants, which is on their website. And that's a list of carbon accountants across the country who should be more than adequate and very familiar with the Carbon Active things, because you have to go through certain tests and training to get on that list. So they could also do your technical assessment for you. So have a look at that list as well. No other questions then. I will.
Someone else has a question. I have another question, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Daniel.
go for it.
So I was just wondering about the certificates, and I know that most certificates you're using, in Australia, are ACCUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Union units.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if the scheme or carbon neutral or anyone is looking into the other schemes, they're like energy saving certificates, or any of the other state certificates, or whether they're looking into different. Because ACCUs are just one type of certificate, but you've got multiple other ones which are reducing carbon, but they're just different types of projects. I'm just wondering if that's something being considered, or if they're totally not being considered.
Yeah, look, I think those things that we're finding through the emission saving schemes, they're not actually purchasable units as far as I'm aware. The ACCUs that you can buy here are basically aligned with projects that are like the Savannah Burning Project, other reforestation projects in Australia that have calculated emission reductions that will be associated with that. You don't have to buy Australian credits as long as they're verifiable and they have a good and can be traced. Like any of the gold standard ones from overseas, there's a lot of overseas emission offsets that you can buy. It doesn't have to be Australian. You can choose whatever you want. And you'll find that a lot of the ones overseas, like in India and places like that, Chinese wind farms, etc., they're often the cheaper, but they're still just as valid as any other offset. So it's worth looking at. But in terms of what's being saved through emission reduction here, I'm not aware that any of that's transitioning into, like, you can't buy offsets for the lights that you put off, that you upgraded in your office, for example. Yeah, I don't know if they're looking at doing that. They probably don't want to double account it, because I think the government, because they're offering rebates, are already accounting for those, and they couldn't be sold on.
Yeah, those certificates need to just get surrendered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, in fact, the emissions for those have already been accounted for, because if you think about it, they're actually getting a reduction in price to do those upgrades, if you like. And the savings they make is basically a carbon credit that they're buying back. And that means it's already been accounted for and already used. So they're not purchasable elsewhere, I wouldn't think. It's double accounting if they are.
Yeah, the certificates are created to deal with a retailer liability.
Yeah. Right, there was one other question, I think. Was there one others?
Danny, there is a question from Kim around the sort of increased waste due to COVID and what's the primary way to best offset expanded office waste. I think that is a really interesting question, and one of the kind of barriers that I can see in that is that we're not measuring waste as well as we could within buildings, getting better, but not within tenancies. So I don't know if you've got any other tips on that. I'd just say we need to be better at measuring it so that we can account for it.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of different waste programs, and we've got some waste programs at CitySwitch, of course, that can help with that sort of thing. But Zoe's absolutely right. The waste emissions from waste and the waste itself isn't really measured very well in the majority of organisations. So, and in that situation, what happens with Climate Active, for example, when you calculate your waste, there's a waste calculator, so it goes on the number of bins and the types of bins and how much recycling and how full they are, etc. And it comes up with a number. But it's much better if you can measure it, and that way you're getting exactly what the right emissions are for that particular organisation. But reducing it is not as easy as it is. And one of the biggest issues with COVID is that just as we got everybody, like keep cups, for example, just as we got everybody used to taking their coffee cup down to the local cafe and using their keep cups, suddenly no one would take them anymore. So now I feel like we've gone back 10 years in relation to just take away cups, if nothing else. So I think we're going to have to go through a re-education program going forward once things start to get back to some sort of normality, which they seem to be now. We'll have to do some sort of re-education and try to get people back into the habit of taking their keep cups, taking their reusable containers, not accepting plastic, and reducing the waste at the source, and then recycling better. And that's, I think, the only way we can do it. Okay, well, we're at 2:00 now. Is there any other questions before I sign off and let everybody get to their next meeting? No? All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. I'll send out the link to the recording later in the week, along with some of those resources. And any other questions, you've got my email address there. Feel free to send me an email or get in touch. Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.